Hello, Minister. It's Edward Lucas here. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Very good. So welcome to the event. I think possibly my microphone was off then, and you couldn't hear me. But I was just saying, you're no stranger to CEPA. We have you in the CEPA, the Washington, and we are very electronically. Your country is in the eye of the storm electronically, and the eye of the storm in terms of diplomacy and espionage, because you've just been sending 2 Russian embassy officials back to Moscow. And I know there's a limit to what you can say in about these intelligence matters, but it appears that one of these diplomats was trying to spread rumors that the other one was involved in a murder plot. So how much can you tell us about this this extraordinary event?
As you have probably noticed, on Friday, the 5th of June, I announced together with the Prime Minister Babiš that the Czech Republic designed 2 staff members of the Russian embassy in Prague as persona non grata and ordered them to leave the country. This came as a result of an investigation into claims that a Russian official, Russian intelligence officer, traveling on a diplomatic passport had entered the Czech Republic carrying ricin. This information proved to be fabricated as a consequence of an internal conflict between 2 employees of the Russian embassy. The Russian side hasn't made use of repeated offers to settle the issue by diplomatic means. Given these circumstances, it is needless to say that Czech-Russian relations do not, unfortunately, flourish at the moment. This is not only because of this case, it is also related to the case of a statue of Marshal Koněv, which is relentlessly exploited by the Russian side in the media. In general, we are promoting constructive dialogue with the Russian Federation. It is our position bilaterally, but also together with our allies in NATO and European Union. We are promoting to have a substantive but value-based dialogue with the Russian side.
And so far, there's been no retaliation. For normally, when we have, as we saw when the British government and its allies expelled Russian embassy officials after the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, and in many other cases, we see a Russian retaliation. So are you expecting that some Czech diplomats will be packing their bags and having to leave Moscow soon?
We are expecting reciprocal steps of Russian side. It has been mentioned by the media statement of Russian officials, including representatives of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it is possible to expect that 2 of our staff from our embassy in Moscow will have to leave Russian Federation.
Well, I'm sure that the atmosphere at the Czech embassy in Moscow is suitably alert as they wait for the news. But it's a very interesting point, the way in which the Russians have been making a weapon out of history and trying to push back so hard against these proposals to move statues and so on. But I wanted to turn, before we get on to the broader Q&A, also to the response of the pandemic and to the lockdown, because you've had a very successful public health response to this in the Czech Republic, and you are now reopening your economy and even receiving visitors. I saw that Visegrad diplomacy has restarted with I think Polish and Slovak heads of government coming. So talk us through the atmosphere in Prague. How's the Czech Republic emerging from this this dreadful few weeks that we've all been experiencing?
I hope that we are emerging stronger than before the crisis. We have certainly learned important lessons how to face shocks like global pandemic. The restrictive measures introduced since the outbreak of the crisis have proven beneficial for the stability and in terms of protection of public health. At the same time, with getting more time to develop new tools of prevention, including smart quarantine, improving applications that can mitigate the risks of the disease and especially its transmission in the society. We are ready to get back to normal. We started already in May, end of April, beginning of May, with the relaxation of some of the restrictions, and at the moment, from the social point of view, we are very close to this situation that can be described as a normal state of play. When it comes to traveling, the border restrictions were introduced in order to limit the risk of international transmission of the disease. It has been introduced by almost all European countries with a different degree of strictness. However, it was one of the main recommendations from our epidemiologists, from our experts, really to focus on stabilizing internally and then allowing for opening back to external world, first with Europe. And we have already opened our borders with almost all our neighbors, where we have free movement right now. We are planning to extend the opening with all safe countries in the European Union from the 15th of June. And even in diplomatic terms, we are starting to return back to normal. We are satisfied with the VTCs, with online tools we have used for diplomatic purposes, but these cannot replace a personal meeting. And I had a pleasure to welcome in Prague and in the country already my Slovak colleague and my Polish colleague. And next week we will have a leaders meeting of Visegrad Group. So that's also proof that the situation is stable and we can return back to the lives we know.
Well, may I ask you then, now that it's possible to meet, what are you going to be talking about? Because we face an extremely difficult international situation with the possibility of American troops being withdrawn from Germany, according to President Trump, the all sorts of difficulties with Russia, as you yourself are experiencing, great worries about China, about the cohesion of the European Union. You must have an absolutely packed agenda for these meetings. What are the top issues for you?
Indeed, we see that the trends that were present or had been present before the outbreak of the crisis can be even more visible and probably even stronger. The deterioration or fragmentation of multilateralism is one of them. But we are concerned also about the implications in terms of increasing international tension, be it the relations between the United States and China. We are seeing also new issues in our transatlantic community, where we are keen to focus on strengthening this bond rather than focusing on the issues that might divide us. And here, I personally am concerned about the impacts of the pandemic for our community of democratic states in Europe and North America, because we are facing much bigger threats outside of our community, and we need to stick together. We need also to focus on how to improve the international system. We are discussing a lot about the role of WHO in the whole pandemic, and our position is that we need to have objective, independent evaluation of the conduct of the organization during the whole crisis. There are legitimate questions whether the leadership of the organization was not siding with an interpretation of one major power, which might undermine the legitimacy and trust in this important organization that has been very successful in dealing with many of the global health issues. I can mention, for example, the Ebola crisis, where WHO played an instrumental role to tackle this disease.
Yes. No, absolutely. And if it wasn't for this pandemic, we would be regarding the WHO as an international success story rather than being such a controversy. But let me just ask you a bit more about China, because in Central Europe, for really ever since 1989, or arguably even before that, it's always been the immediate eastern neighborhood that's been a worry. Soviet occupation, Russian imperialism, the wars about history, worries about Ukraine, which we might get onto in a moment. But now we have a new worry, which is the threat to the international order from the People's Republic of China. And we see very firm pushback on that from the US administration, a great reluctance in some quarters in Europe to go along with that. Voices in Italy, in Germany, in some other countries saying, no, let's not get into some kind of new Cold War with China. The Americans have their fight and we stay out of it. For an Atlanticist country like the Czech Republic, where do you stand on that? Are you in with the Americans, or are you going to put European, distance yourself from that and adopt a European policy?
First of all, I believe we are not facing a new Cold War situation. What is more likely is that we have two competing worldviews or global narratives that present effective solutions to issues that concern all of us. We are discussing more and more about the battle of narratives here. Represented by democratic liberal societies on one hand and autocratic regimes on the other hand. And here we as a democracies need to stick together and to promote our values, to promote the key priorities or key principles on which our societies has been built over the past decades. And for that, we believe we need to stick together with the United States, with Canada, but we need to work much more closely with other like-minded countries. There is also Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and many democracies around the world that face the similar concern about authoritative regimes presenting themselves to be more effective now in dealing with pandemic, but also in terms of economic competitiveness, introduction of new technologies. And we need to discuss together how to come up with more effective answers to our citizens' concerns. I think that there is a key for that.
One of the key issues here, though, is Taiwan, because the People's Republic of China has kind of abandoned its previous approach of a fudge of live and let live, where Taiwan was they got on with trade and economic and cultural and social links with Taiwan and didn't push the issue too hard about recognition. And now we see the leadership in Beijing really going hard after anyone who has any ties with Taiwan. You've seen that in the Czech Republic, where the Chinese ambassador was trying to bully your colleague in the Foreign Trade Ministry not to have the Taiwan representative even to sit in at a meeting. And we've seen the mayor of Prague making his own efforts to push back on that. So Taiwan has become a very live issue. And now we see the Speaker of the Senate, Miloš Vystrčil, picking up the baton from his late predecessor, Jaroslav Kubera, and saying he wants to go to Taiwan as part of an official Czech delegation. Now, you've opposed that because you say you want to uphold the One China policy, but surely it's possible to uphold the One China policy and still to have strong or maybe even strengthened ties with Taiwan.
First of all, I have to stress that the Czech Republic has traditionally good relations with Taiwan. We have good cooperation in many areas, including trade, investment, culture, but also education, science, and tourism. And we share values such as democracy, plurality, and human rights. So it is important to remember that. Following Japan and the Republic of Korea, Taiwan is also the third most important Asian investor in the Czech Republic. So we see the benefits of cooperation with Taiwan. And now we also have been an advocate for having Taiwan and its experts to be more involved in the work of WHO, because all parties who are eager to share the experiences, expertise, should have been allowed to do it. And on the Chinese position, we have seen a growing assertiveness and also redefinition of red lines when it comes to cooperation with Taiwan. We have adopted our One China policy already in the 1990s, as most European countries did at the time. But it includes the right to cooperate with Taiwan at an economic level, at technical level. We only exclude political ties with a partner that we do not recognize as a state. There we only need to stick to our principles. That was why I also explained to the president of our Senate that if we are to face the assertive position of China, it is not by framing differently our positions. It is by just continuing what we have been doing for 20 years.
It must be a bit difficult for you as the foreign minister to see the mayor of Prague taking such a prominent role in international affairs. He's at the front of the memory wars with the discussion of statues, there's renaming of streets. He's had a very clear line on China, with his own background as a student in Taiwan, and rejecting the idea that the city of Prague is bound by the One China clause in the agreement they had with the People's Republic. Do you see Mayor Hřib of Prague as an ally or as a competitor?
I see him as a communal politician, local politician.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Let's move on to a question on Ukraine, which has come in from Petr Borisov. And he says, can you evaluate, please, the relationship of the Czech Republic with Ukraine and the prospects for closer political and military ties in future? We've obviously seen a political upheaval in Ukraine with the election of President Zelensky and a completely new seeming political landscape there. How does Ukraine? It's a close neighbour for you. Just one country in between you and the border with Ukraine. What's your assessment, and how do you see relations developing?
Ukraine is a very important partner for Czechia. We have very close contacts at the governmental level. It is illustrated by my visit to Ukraine in 2019. I also met Ukrainian Minister for Foreign Affairs here in Prague during his tour in Central Europe. And Prime Minister Babiš also had a successful visit with a business delegation in Kiev. We have to also stress the fact that there are very strong people-to-people contacts between our two countries. Thousands of Ukrainians study in the Czech Republic. We have very robust Ukrainian community in the country that is well established. We also share a lot of interest in culture, in many areas, and Czech Republic has been a very strong and vocal advocate of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And here we see Ukraine as a very important partner, not only for us bilaterally, but as an important country for European Union, key partner within the Eastern Partnership policy, key for the security of whole Europe. So I believe there is a great potential for the future. I believe that if the Ukrainian government will continue in the reforms, it may also further bring much stronger economic and political ties between the EU and Ukraine.
One of the questions we face is the 3Cs initiative, which was meant to be meeting this month in Tallinn, and that summit's been postponed until October, which is obviously sad, but it does give us more time to think about the future of this organization. The aim is to create a framework for discussing connectivity between the Baltic, Black Sea and Adriatic, to some extent a rival to the Chinese-sponsored 17+1. When you look at the 3Cs initiative, would you support Ukraine being brought into this as a full member to maximize the impact of this framework?
We have a very pragmatic approach to all connectivity initiatives in the region. We believe that all relevant stakeholders should be involved, because the highways, railways, pipelines, they have no sense if they end on the borders, while they should continue. So for us, the 3Cs initiative is about specific projects to see what projects will be possible to fund through the 3Cs fund. And on Ukraine's membership, it is up for the discussion.
And in terms of the 17+1, do you think that this this format, this Chinese-sponsored format, has perhaps become rather too important, and it would be better to have participation at a more sort of pragmatic working level, sending maybe deputy economics ministers rather than heads of government or heads of state? Because the Chinese are very keen to give more momentum to the 17+1, and this arises a lot of concern in Brussels and Berlin and indeed in Washington.
We have the same pragmatic approach to 17+1 initiative. This is a platform for discussing concrete projects. It is not seen as a political vehicle for us, and we are open also to our European partners, and we are supporting full transparency. And I have discussed it with all my colleagues that are engaged in the discussions, that we don't see any in compliance with European rules. On the contrary, we have always stressed that the projects need to comply with EU rules and regulations, with the interests of connectivity in the whole EU area.
One question, and I wanted to ask you about Belarus, because we saw, you mentioned that diplomacy is restarting, and it was great to see Czech and Polish and Slovak politicians getting together. But there's been something quite interesting happened 4 days ago, which was that the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, went to Minsk, and the regime in Minsk has been something of a diplomatic pariah in recent years because of the, not least, the repression of the opposition, the murder of and abduction of opposition activists, and other things that have given great cause for concern. But Mr. Orban had a very successful visit and said that the cooperation should improve and that sanctions should be lifted, and that Hungary and Belarus are much closer than people think. I just wonder, what's the Czech view on Belarus? Do you see room for manoeuvre to try and maybe take advantage of the difficult relations that Belarus now has with Russia to pull Belarus a bit back towards Europe, or do you think that it's time to keep the pressure up? And do you think Mr. Orban's visit was helpful?
It is not surprising. My Hungarian colleague has advocated several times to have more intensive dialogue with Belarus at the moment, having in mind also the tensions in the relations between Moscow and Minsk. At the same time, we cannot give up on our values and on key principles in relation to Belarus. Maybe to mention one, Belarus is the last country in Europe that still have a death penalty in place. There has been continuous violations of fundamental freedoms. This has to change if there is mutual beneficial cooperation between the EU and the country. However, the truth is that maybe the current situation provides a window of opportunity to have more serious dialogue about both areas where we have common interest, but also about issues where we might not meet at the moment, but we want the regime in Minsk to change its position.
Well, I'm sure we'll be discussing this more in the weeks and months ahead, but we are out of time now. So I want to, from my position here in London with a picture of beautiful Prague behind me, I want to thank on behalf of CEPA and also the 30 people who were tuned in over the internet or dialed in by phone to listen to this, to thank you, Minister Petříček, very much for your frank, informative, insightful answers, and we look forward very much being able to see you again properly face to face at some CEPA event once conditions have loosened a bit further. But in the meantime, our best wishes and many thanks to you and your colleagues in Prague and to all those who tuned in, and goodbye from CEPA.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you very much for the invitation, and all the best to all listening. Goodbye.
Bye.